We all know that philosophers are clever people, and although they usually use their vast intellects to solve the deepest questions humanity has posed, sometimes they use it to craft cruel and poetic insults. Some of those insults have been brutal, and they remind us that even the most lofty of minds can be vindictive and puerile. So here is a list of my top 20 philosopher insults. I'm going to start with every philosophy undergraduate's favourite punching bag, Rene Descartes. If there's ever been a student essay arguing for substance dualism or skepticism, then I haven't read it. But you might feel a little less sorry for him after hearing a couple of insults he threw at others. The first to feel the lash of the Cartesian tongue could hardly have been less deserving. Blaise Pascal was a brilliant and prolific mathematician, physicist, and philosopher. He died tragically young at the age of only 39, and is sadly most famous for a last-ditch wager that he offered the recalcitrant atheist. But that didn't stop Descartes from saying, "Monsieur Pascal has too much vacuum in his brain." If the first Cartesian insult was brief and direct, the second was flowery and a touch absurd. It's the kind of insult that would be most at home in a Monty Python movie.
Your mother was a hamster and your father smelt of elderberries.
This corker was aimed at Gilles de Roberval, a French philosopher and mathematician who regularly got into feuds, including with Descartes. Of Monsieur Roberval, Descartes said, "He is as vain as a girl, has a head like a dwarf, and behaves like the fool in an Italian farce, who continues bragging even after having his ears boxed and his face slapped with a slipper." My next insult was composed by a famous English writer, opium addict, and serial insulter, Thomas de Quincey. Although de Quincey isn't strictly speaking a philosopher, he makes the list because this insult was aimed at one, fellow countryman John Locke. Although John Locke died 81 years before de Quincey was born, he nevertheless wrote, "Against Locke's philosophy I think it an unanswerable objection that, although he carried his throat about with him in this world for 72 years, no man ever condescended to cut it." To Arthur Schopenhauer now, who held a deep disdain for his nation's preeminent philosopher, Georg Hegel. When Schopenhauer landed a professorship at Hegel's university, the University of Berlin, he insisted that his lectures be conducted at the same time as Hegel's classes. This didn't work out so well for Schopenhauer, and after he saw his class reduced to 0 students, they eventually let him go. Schopenhauer's hatred of Hegel, both as a person and as a philosopher, was relentless. In this particularly withering tirade, he said, "Hegel, installed from above by the powers that be as the certified great philosopher, was a flat-headed, insipid, nauseating, illiterate charlatan who reached the pinnacle of audacity in scribbling together and dishing up the craziest, mystifying nonsense." Next we go to a Danish philosopher who is famous for his deeply religious outlook. Søren Kierkegaard was a devout Christian, but he despised many aspects of the organised church. One person that, for Kierkegaard, epitomised all that was rotten about the church was Bishop H.L. Martensen, of whom he said, "My opponent is a glob of snot." Karl Marx thought that Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism was used to intellectually justify the capitalist status quo, which, for Marx, was bad. Hence he wrote of him, "The arch-Philistine, Jeremy Bentham, was the insipid, pedantic, leather-tongued oracle of the bourgeois intelligence of the 19th century." Oh, Friedrich Nietzsche. How the insults flow so naturally and prolifically from your pen. If I had been short of material, I could have used several examples from Nietzsche, but in the end I've only gone for 2. The first of these is aimed at the man who is generally considered to be the founding father of Western philosophy, Socrates, of whom he said, "Socrates belonged by origin to the lowest folk. Socrates was rabble. One knows, one can still see for oneself how ugly he was." From the original philosopher to quite possibly the greatest, Immanuel Kant. Nietzsche had clearly read and been influenced by Kant, nevertheless he called him that most deformed concept cripple of all time. But what goes around comes around. Bertrand Russell certainly pulled no punches when talking about Nietzsche, saying, "It is obvious that in his daydreams he is a warrior, not a professor. All the men he admires were military. His opinion of women, like every man's, is an objectification of his own emotion towards them, which is obviously one of fear. Thou goest to woman, forget not thy whip." But 9 women out of 10 would get the whip away from him, and he knew it. So he kept away from women, and soothed his wounded vanity with unkind remarks. Well, Russell would know about women. He was married 4 times. But as far as insults go, what goes around comes around. Did I say that already? Ludwig Wittgenstein was a close colleague of Russell's at Cambridge, but he certainly wasn't a fan of all his work, commenting that Russell's books should be bound in 2 colours, those dealing with mathematical logic in red, and all students of philosophy should read them, those dealing with ethics and politics in blue, and no one should be allowed to read them. And with that, we reach the halfway point, and also the end of my insults from dead philosophers. The second half features insults from living philosophers, at least at the time of recording this video. And that's an important disclaimer, because the first 2 examples come from Noam Chomsky, who is, at the time of this recording, 95 years old. But he had little time for French philosophy, saying, "French intellectual life has, in my opinion, been turned into something cheap and meretricious by the star system. It is like Hollywood. Thus we go from one absurdity to another. Stalinism, existentialism, Lacan, Derrida. Some of them obscene, Stalinism, some simply infantile and ridiculous, Lacan, Derrida. What is striking, however, is the pomposity and self-importance at each stage. The inclusion of Lacan in his list of bad philosophy is telling, because my second insult from Chomsky takes aim at a philosopher who's a great admirer of Lacan, Slavoj Žižek. There's no theory in any of this stuff, not in the sense of theory that anyone is familiar with in the sciences or any other serious field. Try to find some principles from which you can deduce conclusions, empirically testable propositions where it all goes beyond the level of something you can explain in 5 minutes to a 12-year-old. See if you can find that when the fancy words are decoded. I can't, so I'm not interested in that kind of posturing. Žižek is an extreme example of it. I don't see anything to what he's saying. But here's the thing. If you insult living philosophers, they tend to insult you back. And Slavoj Žižek duly obliged when he said, Chomsky always emphasises how one has to be empirical, accurate. Well, I don't think I know a guy who is so often empirically wrong. Perhaps then it's safer to insult dead philosophers. And that's what Alan Wolfe did when, in 2012, he had this to say about Ayn Rand. Adam Smith is a first-rate thinker, and Ayn Rand is an amateur. In the academy, she is a non-person. Her theories are works of fiction, her works of fiction are theories. And bad ones at that. Another who took aim at the dead was Camille Paglia, who admitted in an essay aptly entitled What I Hate About Foucault that I miss no opportunity to throw darts at Foucault's scrawny haunches. Now this minor insult isn't what I'm offering here, because in another place Camille says, the truth is that Foucault knew very little about anything before the 17th century, and, in the modern world, outside France. His familiarity with the literature and art of any period was negligible. His hostility to psychology made him incompetent to deal with sexuality, his own or anybody else's. The more you know, the less you are impressed by Foucault. We've now had insults from dead to dead philosophers, living to living philosophers, and living to dead philosophers. The rest of my list consists of insults delivered in the form of scathing book reviews. So these are insults kindly designed to be published, read by their insultee, and anyone else interested in their work. Often these insults are interwoven throughout a particularly harsh review, so I've only selected a few lines from the barrage, but hopefully enough to get the point across. When James Claggy was asked to review a contribution to a collection of essays by David Wiggins, he spent most of the time commenting on his writing style. In particular, he provides detailed and broken down statistics about the length of Wiggins's sentences. He notes that the average sentence length throughout the entire review is 30 words, and mentions several that were over 100. Claggy was not impressed, remarking that readers should not have to be subjected to this sort of writing, no matter how profound the thoughts expressed. Philosopher John Keeks, arch-enemy of egalitarianism and all its defenders, was once asked to review a book by one of those defenders, Martha Nussbaum's Hiding from Humanity. Of this work, Keeks says, running through the book is a barely controlled indignation at society's failure to conform to Nussbaum's passionately held views. Intended or not, these anecdotes and the perfervid tone serve as rhetorical stratagems to disarm or bully the reader and divert attention from the abject failure of the case Nussbaum is making, from ideological differences to those of a more personal nature. Colin McGinn wrote a particularly scathing review of a book by an ex-colleague of his, Ted Honderich. According to Honderich, they used to have a good, jokey relationship, but one day he remarked to McGinn that his new girlfriend was less plain than his old one. Maybe that's why McGinn wrote, "This book runs the full gamut from the mediocre to the ludicrous to the merely bad. It is painful to read, poorly thought out and uninformed. It is also radically inconsistent." But again, we have another of those what goes around situations. A few years later, it was one of McGinn's books up for review. No, it wasn't Honderich dishing the hurt, it was Nina Strominger, who wrote of McGinn's work, "Perhaps this book is useful as an aesthetic object in itself. An emblem of that most modern creation, the pop philosophy book. Actual content, thought or insight is entirely optional. The only real requirement is that the pages stroke the reader's ego, making him feel he is doing something highbrow for once, something to better himself. The sad fact is that the reader would learn more by reading Mad magazine." One more to go, and it's my favourite. But first, if you're new here, this is a philosophy channel where I interview academics, present my views, and explain philosophical ideas. If that sounds like your thing, then consider subscribing. I also offer one-on-one philosophy lessons, and you can see the description for that. And I have a membership program where I go through great but neglected philosophical works of the past. Now back to the insults. This final book review was written by my own PhD supervisor, Alex Oliver. And trust me when I say that Oliver is a man of exactitude. He takes his Frege very seriously, and I suspect it was Robert Brandon's slapdash handling of Frege in the early part of his book that led to this harsh review. Oliver said, "Jackets are designed to push one from the shelves to the till, and this jacket has the lot. An enigmatic photo of a Japanese town, eulogistic quotes, and an author who looks for all the world like a member of ZZ Top." I'm sorry not to be able to soften these criticisms with the customary concluding politeness. Anyone working in the field will want to read this book. The brutal fact is that the theory of meaning at the core of Brandon's project is in places ill-defined, at others inconsistent, and at yet others plain wrong. And that's 20. Remember, please like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.